What's up, my wizards? It's Dev from Mtg. We like magic, and today we're going to look at a deck that's stacked, but it's in some danger of falling through the cracks. So here's blue-black artifacts.
And I'm your favorite magic channel's favorite magic channel. Best believe that the professor go bananas for my deck techs. I come correct like a porn star, slicing up all these other suckers with my sword mark.
And we're back. Well, I gave Patreon 4 different blue decks to vote on, and this is the one they wanted to see by a pretty wide margin. And I can see why, because these improvised lists are quietly some of the best decks in the format right now. Right now, there are some decks that are getting a lot of attention. The green-white mid-range lists, the blue-white historic and control lists, even the Godfarer's gift lists are making a comeback right now, and so this deck is kind of getting lost in the shuffle. I think it's a crime because this thing plays a ton of powerful cards and probably gets the most use out of what is maybe the best card in all of Dominaria, and that's Karn. Finally, to talk about this card in a deck tech, first of all, a quick glance at MTGO League results and the few tournament results that we have so far in the Standard will tell you that a lot of the big dogs are just jamming a couple of copies of Karn because he's worth it and he's that good and he can go in any deck, and we all told you he'd be really good, and it turns out he is. This is my #1 card in Dominaria, well, for a reason, because it can do work in just about any list, but again, in our list, it's doing the most work because when we plunk it down on curve, this thing can already start making like 5/5s and even 6/6s in some cases because we have a ton of cheap artifacts. Some of our artifacts make more artifacts because it's like, yo dog, I heard you like artifacts, so that's what this entire deck is about. It's very easy to have a field full of artifacts by the time you drop your Karn, and forget like 5/5s and 6/6s. You top deck a Karn late and suddenly you're dropping like 8/8s. Whoops. So Karn is just ridiculous in just about any decks because, he's a great card advantage engine. He does that here too, but he can also pop out the legit biggest creatures in the deck, so he's at his best here. Although Karn is one of the best of our payoffs, he's not the only payoff for playing a bunch of artifacts. We've got a lot of them, and in fact, he's actually not even the only planeswalker. So we're playing a couple of copies of Tezzeret the Schemer in here too. Now, Tez goes in here because he does the one thing that Karn can't do, which is kill guys, His second ability is actually really reliable removal because, again, just like when we pop down a Karn, we can make huge dudes. We can also kill relatively big guys if we get a Tezzeret on curve for the same reasons. And on top of that, synergizes with Karn pretty well too. He poops out little Ethereum cells that synergize not only with Karn, but with everything in the deck that needs artifacts, and they ramp us, fix our mana if we need that. Tezzeret's pretty good in terms of utility, and if we get to the ultimate, which actually isn't too far away from when we first play him, then he provides some pretty good inevitability too, Just one of our dumb artifacts that we're not doing anything with anymore becomes a real threat every single turn from then on out, and eventually that's going to steamroll the opponent. So Tezzeret just does kind of everything. Karn really does everything, but Tezzeret does all the other things. Now, 4-ofs are a relative rarity in this deck. You're not going to see a whole lot of them, but we did reserve 4 whole slots for Herald of Anguish because it is that good. We need 4 of these. This card is the whole reason that I hold off from calling Karn like the best artifact payoff in the deck, because this might very well be the best. Actually, this is really good for dealing with small creatures, larger boards. If we have the artifacts, we can take out a couple of things. That's important. Or we can just send this in, and then if a big creature blocks it, then we can just give that creature, -2/-2 by sacrificing an artifact. We can use that to take down Lyra Dawnbringers and everything else in between. If we have enough artifacts, this can even take out like Hazarets and Ronuses and indestructible things. There's just really no limit to how good that ability actually is. Oh, and in the meantime, by the way, it's a 5/5 flyer, so have that too. By the way, it's also got an ability that just completely stuffs control decks, so it's good against pretty much everything. This is actually, low-key one of the better cards in the format if you can build a good deck around it. We absolutely have, so we should play all 4 copies because it's one of the most important threats we're playing. But that's actually not all of the artifact payoffs yet, but there's a lot of payoffs in this deck. So before we get to the actual artifacts, I just want to show you a couple of 1-ofs that I'm playing, and I'm not the only one doing this. A lot of people are jamming a couple of fun-ofs in this deck, and I want to have fun, so I'm going to play 1 copy of Zahid and 1 copy of the Antiquities War. Now, sometimes you won't see either one of these cards. You'll see 2 Zahid, you'll see 2 Antiquities War. Sometimes those 2 are in the sideboard instead of the main deck. So I don't think this improvised list is completely nailed down right now in just about any iteration. But usually if it's not a Grixis improvised list, you will see these cards somewhere in the 75 somewhere. Zahid is really good because it's an answer to Lyra Dawnbringer. I know I've already said it a couple of times in various deck techs and in different analyses of Zahid, but I just want to keep bringing it up because there's really not not a whole lot in the format right now that can naturally block, or attack into, for that matter, a Lyra Dawnbringer, and it's a really important card right now. And not only that, it obviously brick walls and flies through just about every other flying threat in the entire format right now, at least the threats that people are playing. So he's good for that reason. He's just a good threat on his own. And sometimes even if you have to hardcast him for all 6 mana, which will not happen very often, but it's going to be worth it if you top deck as a Heed late in the game and you just don't mind paying all the mana for him because you've got it, and he's always going to be a good threat whether you play him on turn 4 or turn 6 or turn 30. Now, as far as the Antiquities War, this is actually a very real card that a lot of people are playing. Again, either main deck or sideboard. You'll often see a copy, or in very many cases, 2 copies of the Antiquities War. This is a great mid-range piece that also provides inevitability. It's very similar to Tezzeret's ability, except it happens to all of your artifacts at once instead of over the course of a few turns, but they don't get to stay, you know, and when the clock strikes midnight, they all turn back into pumpkins, effectively, but sometimes one turn is all that you need. But to get all these crazy payoffs, we got to play a lot of artifacts, and we prefer them to be cheap because most of our big threats are all like 4 mana and above, so all of our early plays have to be artifacts in order for this to work. So start things off, and play 4 copies of Renegade Map and 2 copies of Treasure Map. Well, I could either do a Dora the Explorer joke or a joke about the yes, but I'll elect to do neither because these are actually very serious cards. They're very important to the deck. You know, Renegade Map we'll play all 4 copies of. This is the best 1-drop artifact we could play. Navigator's Compass, Hope of Girapur, they get some consideration, but again, for my money, this is the one, guys. You know, this both lowers the land count while simultaneously upping the artifact count for just the 1 mana too. So Renegade Map definitely goes in. Fixes our mana, improvises for us in the meantime. Just everything about Renegade Map is yes. Treasure Map is a pretty important artifact too. It's an early drop. We need as many of those as we can get our hands on. It scries for us. That'll help fix our draws. Good in a deck full of 2 and 3 ofs and stuff. To find the right pieces, this helps us do that. And once it does flip over, it's ramp, that's great, and it provides a bunch of treasures for Herald of Anguish to eat, or for, you know, to make Karn's guys way bigger. Just, this is a really versatile piece, and by the way, help you draw cards too. So just kind of everything about Treasure Map is great. Now, in terms of early drop artifacts, I'm also going to make room for 4 Servo Schematic and 4 Prophetic Prism. Now, these don't look like much, but they definitely add up to way more than the sum of their parts. These are great role player artifacts that actually kind of do a lot for us. You know, Servo Schematic makes 2 artifacts. Again, that'll be relevant with Karn, and it's one of Herald of Anguish's like best snacks. Like, Servo Schematic is great. It essentially provides 3 different artifacts for Herald of Anguish to munch on when we need him to, so that's good. Makes Karn's guys way bigger too. Just, yes, Servo Schematic. I know it doesn't look like 4 of viable material, but every improvised deck in the format's playing 4 because it's important to. Same thing with Prophetic Prism, right? This doesn't look like much, but it does get us a whole card, which is a lot. Again, lots of 2 and 3 ofs in this deck. Drawing cards is really, really important. Plus, it'll help us improvise things. It's an artifact for all the things that need artifacts. Fixes our mana. I mean, these don't look like much, but they do way more for us than it might look like at first glance. Now, I'm going to make room for 3 copies of Walking Ballista here. To my surprise, a lot of improvised decks play 2 copies of Ballista main. I think it's important enough to get 4 copies, to be honest. I just don't know where I want to put that 4th copy. So instead, I'll concede just a little bit and go up to 3 from the usual main deck too. This card just does everything right now. It's one of the best threats in the deck, and there's a couple of ways that we have of getting more mana. You know, Tezzeret produces Ethereum cells. Eventually, Treasure Map will produce treasure, so we've got some ramp, and by the way, Treasure Map will also turn into ramp eventually. So we've got ways of getting real mana in this deck. That's great with Walking Ballista, whether you're casting it late as like a burn spell, you know, or a surprise like kill 2 of your guys spell. It's very easy to make Walking Ballista a late 2-for-1. Or you're playing them early. You know, sometimes you want an early, you know, kill spell against Llanowar Elves or the myriad of 1 toughness. There's so many 1 toughness creatures right now that Walking Ballista is pretty good against on turn 2, whether you're on the play or the draw for that matter. So I don't see a reason to only play 2 main deck copies. You know, this is sometimes a game-ending threat if the game goes long enough, and if it's not that, it's early game removal. There's just literally nothing bad about Walking Ballista in the current format, so I think 3 copies is at least valid, and 4 is probably a consideration. But I've got one more permanent to show you before I get to basically the removal spells here and finish the deck up. And this was a journey to find exactly which 3-drop creature I wanted to play, you know. I'll go a little bit more into what I didn't choose towards the end of the video when I talk about stuff you could play, stuff I didn't play, all that stuff. But for now, I want to go ahead and show you what I ended up on, which might surprise you. We're playing 2 copies of Weaponcraft Enthusiast. Again, had a lot of options here, so why exactly did I end up on Enthusiast? Well, first of all, it's a board in a box. It's great on defense, good in the early game, because again, we're trying to play 1- and 2-drop artifacts here. We're not going to play a lot of early blockers, so this is pretty good for that. You know, it at least buys us a turn on turn 3 a lot of the time, which is pretty good if we get it in our opening hand, so I'll take that. Plus, it's 2 artifacts and a body. Again, great with Karn, good with Herald of Anguish. There's a million reasons why we'd want a creature that gives us 2 artifacts. We can block with the creature and not actually lose any of the artifacts. You know, they have to sweep us in order for us not to have an artifact on turn 4, as long as we get Weaponcraft on turn 3, you know. Sometimes if we just cast an artifact or an artifact creature on turn 3 and it's the only artifact out, well, they can abrade it or they can otherwise remove it or something, and then we get like no value really out of Karn on turn 4, or we can't cast Herald of Anguish as quickly. There's a million reasons why we need these artifacts. Well, with Weaponcraft, it's kind of an insurance plan, you know. It's a way to get a bunch of artifacts and force your opponent to sweep, or else you'll definitely have an artifact or 2. But to finish up the main here, I'm going to show you what all removal we're playing, starting with the 3 copies of Fatal Push here. Only 3 copies. You know I love 4 copies, but 4 copies of Push is actually becoming less and less common. That said, this can get you out of a lot of jams in the early games, whether you're facing down Llanowar Elves or Bomat Couriers or any number of, you know, 2-drop creatures, or if you can manage to revolt it, even things like Steel Leaf Champion and stuff. This Fatal Push is still just as good as it ever was, so it definitely finds a way to make it into the deck. We're also going to play a couple of copies of Battle at the Bridge here. Another improvised spell, and not the last one, actually. Even though I've only got one more spell to show you. This isn't the last improvised spell. This is very important, obviously. We don't have a whole lot of other ways to take down Hazoret and big stuff like Lyra in the main deck. You know, we've got a couple of ways in our creature base. Herald of Anguish, Zahid, all that. But we need an actual spell that can take these things out. And not only does it kill these things, by the way, also gives us some life back, buys us a turn or 2. That's really important. It's actually not bad early, but if you draw it super late, you know, you top deck a Battle of the Bridge on turn 12 or whatever, suddenly you will definitely kill the biggest creature on the other side of the board, there's almost no doubt, and you'll gain a butt ton of life back. So this can create big swinging situations where you turn the corner really easily, or it can just be a fine versatile removal spell, whatever you need it for. But the last spell in the main deck is the 3 copies of Metallic Rebuke that we're playing. And I've become convinced that even though this isn't the best card in the deck, obviously, the deck kind of can function without a piece like this. You know, at first I wasn't on this at all. Went up to 2, realized it's a pretty good card, and then realized that every other improvised deck in the entire format is playing 3 copies of this. We probably should too, because it's that good. This is basically a way to make sure that on critical turns, spells that we need to resolve actually do resolve. And conversely, it's also a way to make sure that spells they really need to resolve don't resolve. So it's good defense whether you're protecting your own important plays or you're denying them theirs. Now here's the mana base. We're on 22 lands here, which I think is the right number. So we got Renegade maps and even treasure maps to eventually help ramp us. Plus, you know, Tezzeret gives us Ethereum cells and stuff. Nothing in the deck, you know, has to be played for over 4 mana if we don't want to. So 22 lands looks like the right number here, and you could do things to spruce it up. I didn't want a ton of tap lands, so I didn't play all 4 fetid pools. You could do that. You could add Field of Ruins or Scavenger Grounds if you really, really wanted to, but you should play at least the 1 Inventor's Fair, because this thing can be pretty nuts when you need it to be. Now here's our sideboard right here, and a card that might immediately jump out at you, especially if you've watched the channel at all, is Settle the Score, a card that I've gone on record as saying is bad. My opinion has not entirely changed. I think that Vraska's Contempt is overall the much better spell, but I'm playing Settle here because I really wanted to try it out with these Planeswalkers. Turns out it's not bad, you know. This gets us to a Tezzeret Ultimate, even if we haven't done anything else with our Tezzeret, not even +1 to once. This gets us immediately to Tezzeret's Ultimate, and it's just a free, you know, 3rd ability from Karn. Now, most of the rest is self-explanatory, but you also see the Phyrexian Scriptures, which were originally in the main deck, but I actually don't think we need this in the main deck. I think that we bring this in against really, really hard aggro. We don't need it against control pretty much whatsoever, and it's okay. Obviously, against other mid-range decks, it's good against tokens and such. but we just won't run into those matchups every single game, and I think it's worth hiding this in the board. Now, I will say, though, that it is really good in conjunction with the Antiquities War. Now, we've made it to the section where I get to talk about all the stuff I didn't play, and there's a lot of it this time, although I'm going to try to go quickly. This deck was tough to build, man. There's a lot of options for this thing right now, and people are building it, like I said earlier, Grixis and Sultai, and obviously in Grixis you get crazy stuff like Maverick Thopterus and Unlicensed Disintegration. Those are ridiculous cards. The Sultai decks are really mostly blue-black artifact decks that are just playing a copy or two of Vraska. There's that. But in this deck, there are a couple of other plans you could try to execute. At first, I wanted to play Heart of Kiran, and in service of that, I was playing a couple of Heart of Kirans, along with some Foundry Inspectors, and even some Dread Shades and Scrap Heap Scroungers. It just doesn't work out in the end. You know, Scrap Heap Scrounger, we don't necessarily have enough creatures to really make work, even with the added creatures. Dread Shade is a little inconsistent with the mana base, so in the end, I'm just not quite sure that any of these cards are where we want to be, but they were my starting point, and they might be a place to return to if you wanted to explore this deck. Now, in the 3-drop slot, I tried all kinds of stuff. I mean, all kinds of stuff before arriving at Weaponcraft Enthusiast. God, can I even name it all? I've already talked about Foundry Inspector. I also tried Chief of the Foundry. I just didn't find either one of these to be quite impactful enough, even though they're cool. You know, Chief of the Foundry is good with Karn and all. You know, Foundry Inspector makes some of our artifacts 0 or 1 mana, but by the time we play them, and then in subsequent turns, it's not quite good enough. We've got the mana anyway. So I didn't really like either one of these. There were cards I did like, though. Like, I actually really liked Skittering Surveyor and Filigree Familiar in this deck after I lost the Heart of Kiran conceit. These are both fine, you know, Filigree Familiar. While, again, I don't think either one of these are as good as Enthusiast in the long run. Filigree Familiar is still a drawn card eventually and some life gained in the very beginning, so it's not a bad 3-drop creature. And Surveyor, better than it looks because it has the ability of getting you to your 4th land, no questions asked, which is important in this deck where all of our best threats start at 4 mana. There are even more in this quest, honestly. Champion of Wits, Amit Eternal, Nimble Obstructionist. I tried a lot of stuff in this slot, but Enthusiast worked the best for me. You can try any of these things out and report back if you want to. And here are your power rankings right here. A final score of 67, which is pretty dang high, and it better be because this deck is fairly expensive. That's mostly the Karns, but there's also some other stuff like Walking Ballista, some of the lands that cost a good bit. So we are spending some money on this deck. We want it to perform, and it absolutely can. This is sort of what I like about these improvised decks, and always have, is that they perform like a combination of a mid-range deck and a combo deck, you know. Sort of both mid-range and combo decks will tend to sacrifice early turns for later game value, you know, sort of a snowball effect. Just like most of the improvised lists that have been around in the last year or so, here, almost 2 years now. This is a solid list, but it's helped out by maybe the best card in not only Dominaria, but some would even say Standard, and that's Karn. The fact that we have Karn now makes this deck way more real than it ever was, and it was kind of real to begin with. So give this deck a shot, because it has a real power. It's an actual contender right now, and it's a lot of fun to play. Again, these kind of feel like playing combo decks sometimes when you get that turn 4 Herald of Anguish or whatever. So give this thing a shot. It's a blast to play, but of course, power comes at a cost, and right now that cost is about $325, which is a huge price tag, but I will atone with a budget deck soon, and honestly, I like doing these like full-scale competitive decks sometimes, so we can really test the limits of what's going on in this Standard, and I think this deck does. Again, this is a real contender right now, and if you want to get it for the lowest price possible, check out the first link in the description. That'll take you to my sponsored TCG player where you can view the deck, order it piece by piece, or the whole thing if you absolutely need to. But if you want to be discerning with your vendors on TCG player, kind of dig a little bit, you know, then you can get this for about $300 right now, cut some of the cost. But if you want to get this deck anywhere else, it's going to cost like $400 at the very least. So follow my advice, hit the link in the description. This is the cheapest place you'll get this thing. And I'm pretty sure I'm tapped out, y'all. So YouTube spiel time. Make sure that you do all the stuff. Like the video. Helps me out a lot. Subscribe. Hit the bell for the notifications. Just ring that dang old thing to make sure you know when I put new videos out. And if you want to know what decks are coming out before they even come out, like you just know the future and stuff, just throw me $1 a month. That's all I ask. Over there on Patreon. I'll leave you a link in the description for that too. Helps out freaking tremendously. Just $1 every 30 days. But pretty sure that's all, unless you want to follow me on Twitter, SBMTG Dev. I think that's the only thing I missed. But in any case, I gotta get out of here for now. Just let me know how you felt about this down there in the comments section. There's so many different options for this deck right now. The numbers could go completely differently than what I've gotten written down here. The cards included could be completely different for that matter. So let me know what you do down there in the comments, and I'll catch you cats later. I'm Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.